Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, wherever you may happen to be in the world, and welcome to No Depletes, Master Your Keystone. My name is Dan, and I'm joined once again by the fantastic Fem and the glorious Faithy. Now we're moving on to possibly one of my least favourite dungeons in the pool at the moment, Theatre of Pain. This is probably one that a lot of people may have issues with, in particular in pugs, especially when it comes to pathing, so we might have a look at that a little bit more closely in comparison to other dungeons, because even though it is just a few wings and it seems very straightforward, getting prides at a good time is really not that easy. But Ben will show you a pretty simple way that you can do that in this video. It's actually a really good path that he's got for you here, but we'll quickly get into this one. So, very first pull of Theatre of Pain, it's only 4 mobs up to the first boss. In this pull, you've got a Bloodhorn, which you can see targeted by Fem at the moment. The one ability of the Bloodhorn is a Tantrum cast, which is an enraged AoE ability. Because it's an enrage, you can end the Tantrum early simply by soothing it, whether if you have a druid or a rogue or a hunter, just throw a soothe on it and it ends it early, which is really good. If you are not able to end it early, your healer needs to be prepared for it because it is quite a significant amount of damage. There is a Ritualist in this pull here as well, which died off pretty quickly. The Ritualist doesn't have a huge amount of HP, it is just a caster which can be kicked, and needs to be kicked wherever possible. From a Necrotic Bolt cast, I believe, is the only thing that it has to
Unholy
kick.
Fervor as well.
Unholy Fervor as well, which I believe is just a buff on a mob.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the other mobs that are in this pack are contenders. They also have enragers on them as well. They hit the tank pretty hard, and they have a charge on a random player, which is just for a bit of damage. It doesn't do much else outside of that, but the contenders are quite nasty. This pull, your tank will probably need to commit something to the pull, as these mobs are pretty difficult for a tank to deal with, but you know, just get this one out of the way and then you can move on to the first boss, which is an Affront of Challengers. 3 bosses, and Fem, do you want to run us through these ones?
Sure. We got, I don't actually know the name, we got the Decapitator, the Accursed, and the Virulent. You want to focus down the Decapitator, the middle one, until 40%, which then will trigger the Fixate. If you have a Soothe, it's soothable, once again. If not, you should swap target, but ideally you do have a Soothe. This is like one of the dungeons where a Soothe actually matters, just because of the first pull and the first boss. The Decapitator does a Slam and a Mortal Strike. Something to note, if your tank is ever out of range of the Decapitator, it is a Fervent Strike type ability, aka it will hit the closest target if the tank is not in range. The Virulent just casts Plague Bolt and also does, I don't actually know the ability, but it like links up with one of the mobs, which makes them heal when they deal damage. You can purge that. As well as the Accursed, which casts Necromantic Bolt, as well as Searing Death. Searing Death is the most important ability. You want to kick that. You need 2 melee kicks or a Shaman to rotate on Searing Death kicks. Also, the Accursed has a shield just like the Decapitator. When it hits 40%, it gets a shield, which makes the things uninterruptible. So once you push that, you just leave it. And usually you would just swap target on higher keys. On this key level, you can probably just hit through the shield. That's probably going to be faster than killing the other ones. And people always, my camera is, Yep,
Fem's ascending.
Yep. People always ask about the correct kill order here. I think the Decapitator into the Accursed, into, what was the other one?
Virulent.
Virulent, yeah. That's the best kill order, I think. Yeah. You want to deal with the one that fixates first, and then the Searing Death dude, and then the other dude.
Yeah, dealing with Decia first, it's the only thing that actually really does damage as long as you're kicking Searing Death. So Decia the Decapitator, once that one's dead, the damage is basically gone. The bolts that Fem mentioned, they are not just tank casts. They do cast on anyone in the group, but they really don't hit hard. They are not that much of a pain at all. But that boss it is relatively easy to deal with. That is where the first lust will go. You certainly don't need it on the first pack. So that boss will fall over quite quickly, especially since that for the most part it can be cleaved as long as your group is being proactive with kicks. And once that boss goes down, we now move down to the lower area, and now you have your choice of which wing you want to go. Like I said, in this route, Fem did design this route specifically to be really good for prides without having to do any skips. I believe it's really good for pugging, as he mentioned. Yeah. So we first move on to the Lich Wing, as I like to call it. The first mobs that you come up to are these little souls, which you saw Fem just go and grab before. They don't have a huge amount of HP, but they are quite deadly mobs. They have random casts, which is just magic damage on a random player in the group, and they have a second cast which is interruptible called Bind Soul, which is just a link between the mob and a player in the group, which does steady damage over time as well as slow them for quite a significant amount, but that should be kicked where possible. You can see the Bind Soul on that individual soul on Necro Uru at the back there. Realistically, if you can keep them permanently locked down through their lifespan, so that you lock them down from when you pull them until they're dead, then you can. But ideally, if you are going to look to push higher keys, you can probably get away with it on a 15, but if you are going to look to push higher keys, you don't want to leave too much of a gap between CC on these mobs if you are going to AoE CC them, because it will sync up their casts, and if they all cast on one person, there will be no reaction time and they will die. That's mainly if you're going to look to push higher keys. It won't matter so much on a 15. You can kind of just let them do as they please on this. As long as your healer's at least somewhat aware of what they're doing, then it probably won't be that much of an issue. But yeah, the soul's relatively straightforward. Given the size of the mobs and the fact that they don't have too much HP, you wouldn't expect them to actually drop out any affixes, but they do. They burst, they drop Spiteful, and so on. So they are still quite nasty mobs at the beginning of this wing. In the room just ahead, there is a lot of zones on the floor that are randomly cast by the boss just as you're running through, but we'll see that in a moment. Yeah, Faithy?
Yeah, so the reason that you can see that we're playing them up here, as Dan said, is due to the next room, where there will be a constant spawn of swirlies that drops very, very quickly, and the soul's channel ability on you is slow. So it's basically very, very dangerous to play them in that room. So usually how you do this is you split the souls up into two pools. So the first pool, you'll take half of the room, and you'll pull them back and you play them in the start of the corridor. It is also important to mention that we see our first Covenant-specific buff here. So the banner. I don't know if you can quickly draw for me, Dan.
Yep.
And what the banner does is it is a Necrolord finally doing something small. And Necrolord banner basically gives you verse and movement speed for 10 minutes. So it's a buff that you emit from
5 minutes.
Is it 5 minutes?
Actually, it's 6 minutes now. It got buffed.
Oh, yeah, it's 6 minutes. Yeah, they changed it. So it's 6 minutes, which emits from you, which gives your team verse and movement speed. It is. I think the radius is quite big, so it's not that you have to stand under the person itself, but basically having a Necrolord does help a little bit. 10% verse isn't like the most major increase, but 10 verse is 10 verse. It is 10% damage increase and 5% damage reduction after all, right?
Yeah.
So if you do have a you remember to take them. They are quite nice to have. And as you can see, we'll finish off the souls, which was half of the room. And then what you'll do next will be remaining souls, which you will pull into the next corridor, so you'll never have to deal with the swirlies, basically. You're basically running very quickly through all of these zones here on just this particular area and just dragging the souls with you, because you're preferably not playing them outside there. As you can see, they land very, very quickly. So it's just not that smart to play them outside. And they do a lot of damage if they do actually hit you. So you take the remaining souls and you get them out into the next corridor. And what you do is just line them. Because they do cast, so it's still important to line them. They can cast the Bind Soul as you're starting to line them, but it's just getting an interrupt and getting them stacked, basically. And then it's pretty much the same as before. Just finish them off.
standing in the doorway is not the best place to pull them. If you are going to pull them through to here, you want to make sure you do run all the way through, because the zones being thrown by the boss of this wing, they can somewhat encroach into the doorway, and it's just asking for someone to be killed if they're going to be standing actually inside of the doorway to fight all those mobs. So make sure you come all the way through, line around the corner just at the top of the stairs here, and then you won't have any issues as you move on through this wing. Next up we have the Portal Guardian. Portal Guardians are pretty important. You actually need to kill them in order to progress any further in the dungeon, so you cannot skip them by any means at all. Two major abilities. First is a curse that you just saw being thrown on the druid in the group here. The curse is quite basic. It is just a shadow damage taken increase. It should be dispelled instantly, or at least as quickly as possible, as the second ability of the Portal Guardian is this Soulstorm right here. Soulstorm is AoE shadow damage. So if you have that debuff out on a player, they're going to be taking significantly more damage than everyone else. The likelihood of them dying is quite high. As long as you can heal through one Soulstorm, chances are you probably won't get a second one on that mob. People will normally have cooldowns going into that mob, at least certainly short-term cooldowns. You know, your true shots might be up there, your combusts. You can see that a Convoke was used by the druid here as well. Killing off that mob quickly, very good. You saw the orb that was dropped by the Portal Guardian here. Go back to the point where it died. So here's why the Portal Guardians are necessary to actually continuing the dungeon. You see the orb that Fem is just about to pick up here? This orb allows you to basically choose your own route through this dungeon, or through this wing of the dungeon. You end up picking up the orb, and you have a choice of two of these little hands to place them on. You've got one at the bottom here, and one here, and that dictates which path you go to. The most perceived, or the route that will be taken, or the route the Fem will take you through here, I believe, is right on this one, and then right again on the next one that comes up.
Yep.
You might see a lot of groups that end up going right on the first one and then left on the second one. Fem has managed to talk me around to his way of thinking in terms of right and then right is probably the best way, because it just changes what mobs you face as you go through, and it is going right twice probably gives you a slightly easier set of mobs as you go forward for sure. So again, going through to the right side, it takes you to the right side, funnily enough, and you come up against two Bone Maguses. Bone Mages are pretty simple. They have a shield on them initially, which is just an absorb. It can be dispelled, but the absorb is not that much, so it will just literally polish it off in an absolute instant. A couple of casts. The Bone Spear is the most important cast that definitely needs interrupting, as it could easily one-shot any of your players. And in the group, it's really fucking deadly. You probably could get through it with a personal, in all honesty, but you know, you've got enough kicks in the group to be able to stop them, so you might as well do it in all honesty. You will see those mobs repeated through the remainder of this wing. There are quite a few of them. But yeah, easy enough to deal with. And we get our first pride here, which is just in time for a particularly hard pack, which we'll be coming up to in a moment. Again, there's a few repeated mobs. There's a Bone Magus in the next pack, as well as a Portal Guardian, but we also have a new mob, which is a Soulbinder. Fem, do you want to run through the Soulbinder for us?
Sure. The Soulbinder does cast Necrotic Bolt as well as the Necrotic Bolt Volley, but it also has a hidden spell that people don't see because it's not a cast, which is basically a damage over time. You can see I get it instantly on the spell, and then it's the spell. It does a lot of damage, so you want to dispel that as much as possible. However, it does apply it more often than your healer will have dispel for. So that's why you want to focus it down as much as you can, and just ideally, if you have a long stun such as Kidney Shot or Hammer of Justice as a paladin, or like Stormbolt. Whatever you can, try to snipe it just as it's about to die. Like if your stun lasts 6 seconds, try to stun it when you think the mob has 6 seconds to live, just to reduce the amount of debuffs that go out for your healer.
Yeah, exactly. It's it can be a particularly nasty mob, but again, just a few kicks and that's normally dealt with quite easily.
Yeah.
Outside of that, I there's only one more mob, or two more new mob types that we have left in this wing. One of them we are about to see in just a moment. These two bone mages on the side are also important to deal with in terms of overall percentage in the dungeon and pride timing. Pride timing is pretty big in this key. Some of the bosses are kind of brutal, in all honesty. Coultharok is not the easiest boss in the world if it goes on for an extended period of time. But again, you can see we had a Portal Guardian here, which means, a choose your own adventure type scenario, pick the right path again, and we head off to the Bone Reaver. Now, even people who've played this dungeon a lot might not know what exactly the Bone Reaver does, as it's not been common practice in a lot of pugs to take this right path. A lot of people think this is harder. It's not. Honestly, the Bone Reaver is kind of straightforward. You see this Bone Spikes cast now. It is just zones on the floor that you want to dodge. Our druid there just decided to not dodge it and is now eating floor, but that's okay. The only other ability is Bone Storm. We all love Bone Storm. Now you can see as the mob is casting Bone Storm, there is a very defined zone around the mob itself. That is a zone of safety. The mob's hitbox is actually quite big. Even as a melee player, you can stand just outside of the Bone Reaver's Bone Storm range and continue to hit the mob while it's spinning. It does move around quite randomly while it's doing that, so you want to make sure that you do have at least somewhat decent reaction time to be able to move away from it if it does start coming towards you. You can probably take a tick or two and not die, but obviously ideally you probably don't want to. Other than that, the mob is fairly straightforward and will just fall over in good time. And after that, you will be moving on to the final section. I can't remember if you pulled aside here or not. I think you did, didn't you?
No, not on here. We played it on the previous platforms.
Yeah, that was it. So that mob falls over, and again, they need to wait for the... You cannot be in combat. Sorry, you can't take the portals if you are in combat. So, unfortunately, with Spiteful, if anyone gets in combat, then ideally everyone wants to wait. Otherwise, you're just leaving people behind, and you're a man down or two men down going on to the next set of trash. But on this last platform, we have the final new mob of this wing, which is the Darkspeaker. Faithy, do you want to run us through that one real quick?
Yeah, so the Darkspeaker have 3 abilities. It has the Spirit Frost, which is basically an ability it will throw on the tank, which does do some damage. However, with the mobs around it, there are interrupts that's probably valued more than that. There's a Soulbinder and there's a Magus, which has the Volley and the Bone Spike, of course. So those are the priority kicks. However, getting the Spirit Hands next is probably the most valuable one. So make sure that you know who is interrupting what and who is interrupting who. And next, the Decapitator has Death Winds, which is basically a frontal whirlwind, which knocks you back and deal a lot of damage. However, if you do get hit by the whirlwind, you're more likely than not to get knocked off the platform and die to 4 damage. So it's basically look out for the winds and don't get hit by it, as it's almost 100% certain death. And lastly, it has a curse, which goes to the target and it starts spawning pools. So it's basically just dodge those pools while the curse is there, and then purge it. Or is it magic? I can't remember.
Curse.
It's a curse, yeah.
Yep.
So deploy the curse if you can. If not, just dodge the circles. And that's basically the mob. And that is the only time you'll see the mob if you do go the route that we're showing you, which is right. However, if you do go left on the second portal, you will see 2 of them. And the reasoning for us pulling it like this, it's basically because a lot of people, or some people, have sometimes a hard time seeing the winds, and with them being there 2 of them at the same time can become a little bit more difficult to take, and that is the reasoning that we're doing them, and that is the first time we'll see them, and the only time we'll see them. There's only one in this round.
Yeah, exactly. As Faithy mentioned, they can be a little bit problematic. That's why you kind of don't want to take that left route. It's probably easier going right side, especially as a range. There's definitely nothing to look at when it comes to the big bone boy. And now we move on to Coultharok, who, a little bit of a tricky boss, I would say, in particular for your healer. There is a little bit to look out for. So we'll run this from the start, and we'll take you through ability by ability. So the first thing that you'll see from Coultharok here is the Phantasmal Parasite, which goes out on 2 players at a time. If you played in BFA and played Siege of Borealis, the last boss there also had the debuff that went out onto 2 players at a time. It is up to your healer to decide who is best to dispel first and who is best to heal through. Obviously, in a coordinated group, you're looking at who has defensive cooldowns, or just who is the best at surviving that type of damage. If one goes on the tank, they're usually absolute last resort to be dispelled. They can normally take that without too much of an issue, particularly if they're a demon hunter, but we know why that is. The next ability on Coultharok is kind of the main gimmick of the fight, the Drawsoul, which you see just going out right now. So if I just wind it back a little bit, just while that one's going on. So you can see it going out right now, and you see these little hands on the floor right here. So, Drawsoul. Coultharok is looking to try and draw your soul out of your body, as the ability might actually state by its name. Doing that, when your soul is out of your body, it will begin trying to run across the floor, and you'll have a massive dot on you, which can overlap with Phantasmal Parasite, and will probably kill you if it does. The reason why you see the Boomkin at the bottom of the screen here standing right behind that, right behind the hands, just in front of him there, is because the soul, if it goes into these hands, it will be gripped to the floor and won't be able to move. To get rid of this debuff, the massive dot on you from Drawsoul, you just need to run back into your soul. You don't have to stand behind it like this druid is doing. You can stand in the hands and it won't do anything to you specifically as the player. And it means you'll just pick up your soul instantly the moment that you are out of the stun duration once the Drawsoul has gone off. If you do successfully pick up your soul, you get a 30% damage buff up until the next Drawsoul begins to cast. Something that's worth mentioning about Drawsoul is if you don't particularly want the damage buff for whatever reason, you can immune the ability, and you can immune it with a lot of different abilities. Standard immunities like Ice Block and Bubble, they obviously work, but things like a Warrior Blade Storm to immune the stun, it just means that you won't take any damage, your soul won't be drawn from your body, and you won't take the dot either. You can also spell reflect the initial hit of Drawsoul when the channel ends. You won't take the debuff, but your soul will start running around the floor. It means that you have the choice of when you want to pick it up. My assumption would be that since the stun itself, or since Bladestorm works to immune it, something like Fleshcraft with the stun immunity Soulbind would also work, which is similar to the third boss in Plaguefall. My assumption is that would also work as well, but I haven't seen that tested. But given that it does work on the third boss in Plaguefall on the Shadow Ambush ability, I would assume that it does work here as well.
It should work as IBF works for it as well, which is the DK.
Yeah, so it's basically the damage is linked to the stun. The damage is not a portion of damage on its own, is the way to think about that one. Other than that, the only other ability on the boss that we haven't mentioned, which I don't think we see on this pull, is an ability called Spirit Reach. If the tank, Coultharok doesn't move, he is rooted to the center of the platform. If your tank goes out of range, he'll begin to cast Spirit Reach, which is quite a hard-hitting ability, but it is kickable. So if your tank does end up moving for whatever reason, there's not normally a reason to move, but if they start moving for any reason and you see that cast going off, just throw a kick on the boss, no big deal, just to make sure that your tank stays safe on that one. I don't know if it chain casts or if it has a lockout. I don't know if you know if it chain casts.
Yeah.
Beautiful. That's good to know. But yeah, boss falls over. Normally Second Lust would not go here, is that right? Because you have the Pride?
Yeah, it would.
Second Lust would go here.
Yeah, we just didn't.
Just didn't. Just decided not to. No problem. Cool, so that's Coultharok. Yeah, right. Now, Fem doesn't agree with me on this, but I guarantee you, Fem, you can make this... You don't have to make this jump, all right? It is slightly quicker. You can just take this portal, similar to all the portals of the platforms in the previous room. You can take this one, it'll just swing you round and into that portal there. No big deal. But you can make this jump with no movement speed increase whatsoever. Fem, I know what you did wrong. If you go through the middle, it's easier. Just going to point that out. Smile. But you can make that jump. If you have any kind of movement speed increase, then yeah, obviously you can make it through. Something that is worth mentioning, however, is that these portals, they do this in the previous room as well. They actually heal you to full HP when you click on them. So if you have Grievous, for example, as you can see here, you've got the Shaman with a stack of Grievous. Fem has a stack of Grievous, but he's going to die and remove it that way. If you do have a stack of Grievous, coming off of this boss, if you just click the portal, take the little RP trip round, and just get rid of that stack of Grievous off yourself, so the healer doesn't have to waste any mana, and you can just move into the next pull with no major issue. But just to see it again, we're going to see him miss the jump and then walk off, which is very good. He's actually missed that jump very consistently. If you ever watch his stream and he's doing a Theatre of Pain, chances are he's just going to walk off an edge, but that's no problem there. All right. We're moving into the Abomination Wing. Now, we're only going to do one pull here, and we're not going to talk about it too much. But Fem, do you want to explain, again, just real quickly, why it is you're doing just this one pull in this wing here?
Well, it's to get Pride for Sav. Because Pride on Sav is very valuable, because it basically allows you to skip one of the dual phases, which sends down 2 DPS and slows down your boss kill by like 30 seconds. In order, if you do this, you, like, without doing this, you would get 1 Pride only in the Sav wing.
Sure.
But you would get that 60% Pride at the same exact spot as you will get the 60% Pride now. You will just push your 80% Pride into here instead of after Sav. So.
Sure. Okay, good, no problem at all. So it is just that one quick pull. It is important to do, again, as Fem mentioned, just for the sake of prides before Zav, and then we move on to the Halls of Might. Now, a few new mobs here, but again, the majority of them are repeated. We're starting off with Arbalists and Conscripts. Do you want to quickly run us through these mobs here, Faithy?
Yeah, so the Conscripts are pretty straightforward. They just hit the tank, pretty much. The Arbalists are a little bit different, as they use an ability called Shoot, which is basically a somewhat heavy chunking ability that just shoots at random people. And then it does a bleed effect on a random target as well, which is called Jacket Quarrel, which basically just deals a lot of damage, and it's just a target that the healer has to heal. A good way to deal with the Arbalist is trying to keep it stun locked for as much as possible and just killing it off in this pack specifically. We'll see more of them later, but in this pack specifically, just kill off the Arbalist, and then you can, as Fem, take the Conscripts into the first mini-boss, which will be the Brutalizer. The Brutalizer has a Savage Flurry, which is a hurting tank ability, which basically just hits the tank. Then it has a Battle Trance, which is an interruptible in-rage ability for the Brutalizer, which you obviously would not like to go through, as in-rages are never fun, especially on very hard-hitting tank mobs. And then lastly, the Brutalizer has a Leap. A nice thing to mention here in the Might Quarter, as we decided to call it, is that there can be 6 different mini-bosses. There's 3 bosses that you'll play against, mini-bosses you'll play against as you go through this, but it would be randomized. There is a way to trigger it, depending on like which one you'd like to get, but we're not too sure how that works.
It's based on melee swings.
Okay, it's based on melee swings. Okay,
Yeah.
so
Yeah, you just wait for, like, if you want the Brutalizer, you wait for the Brutalizer to melee the other guy, and then you go walk in to trigger him to win the duel.
So there
It's really tricky though. Like,
yeah,
I try to do it all the time, and I don't know, 50-50.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. So first of all, you can have the Brutalizer that we just talked about, or you can have the, what's it called? It's the Mangler, and the Mangler has an interrupt, the enrage, the same one. It has a blade, which it throws on the ground, which basically just does a lot of damage that if you stand in it, so just move the boss away or move yourself.
It only throws on range.
Okay, yeah, it only throws on range. So if you're ranged, don't stand in melee, basically.
Yeah.
And then it does a whirlwind, which is basically just a whirlwind, where it will cast a whirlwind ability and you just run out of the circle, which deals a lot of damage if you don't. It's just a small circle of melee, run out of that, and then you can keep hitting the boss. Up next, there is Bloodthirsty and Breaker. And we had the Breaker. Yeah. So the Breaker, as we're playing here, the one that we got, has, again, an interrupt. This is pretty common. They all have an interrupt, which is the enrage that you just like to interrupt. Then the Breaker also has a frontal, which is pretty easy to dodge. Tanks can dodge it as well. So just move out of that frontal. And then it just has a tank hitting ability, which hurts, which is Colossal Smash, if I reckon, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, that's basically it. Pretty straightforward. And the other mini boss you can have here is the Bloodthirst. And the Bloodthirst has the interrupt. It has a bleed blade, which basically focuses the player and throws a blade on them, who will get a bleed. It basically does quite a decent amount of damage on said person. So as a healer, just look out for it and heal them up. And lastly, it has a charge, where it will focus an area and will charge to it. You can stand in between the charge area and the mob itself. It is only in the area that the charge will end that it will actually do damage and do a lot of damage. So just get out of that circle swirly, and that's the Bloodthirst. And you do also get your first Pride in the Might Wing here. And this Pride is actually really nice, as the next pack coming up can actually be quite scary, which is the Captain Pack. The reason for the Captain Pack to be very scary is due to the Arbalist. Again, there's 2 Arbalists in this next pack, and Arbalist, even with 1, does a lot of damage due to the bleed effect and the random shots. And if you get like 2 bleeds or 2 shots at the same time, it could prove to be fatal, even in the 15. The one mob that's different here is the Captain. The Captain has an aura that decreases all damage taken to the mobs around him, and has an interrupt called Demoralizing Shout. So you just want to interrupt the Demoralizing Shout and then kill the Captains as fast as possible. What you can do, if you do have a DK that's not unholy, you can control the pet, and you can take the pet with you, and you can get the damage reduction aura from the pet throughout the dungeon, and you can basically abuse that. However, if you're unholy, it's not worth it, as your pet damages all your damage. But if you play Blood or you play Frost, that is definitely a viable strategy you can do. And after the Captain is dead, it's the Arbalist that you want to focus down, kill them off as quickly as possible. You can kill one off first and then the other one after, but the faster they die, the better. They do a lot of damage. You don't want to deal with them for too long.
What's worth noting about the Captain and what Faithy said about controlling it through the dungeon is that the buff that it gives to the mobs that it's with when it's not controlled, the AoE damage reduction, I believe, is the same as the squad leaders in Spires of Ascension that we pointed out before. It's a 75% AoE damage reduction. But if you control it, it's not that strong. That does get reduced to, I believe, 10%, and the damage increase that you get is 2%. So it's not huge, but it is helpful. If nothing else, it makes this pack go quicker. You don't necessarily have to keep it for the rest of the dungeon. You can just, obviously uncontrol it and kill it afterwards. But yeah, just to know that it's not going to make, say Blood DKs amazingly OP in this particular dungeon because you have that mob. It's a little bit toned down for us.
Yeah. Yeah, basically. What you can also do is you can just full CC it with like an incap or a blind, etc., and just kill off the other 4 mobs first and then kill the Captain alone, which could also be a way safer way. And lastly, we have the 2 remaining mini bosses, which can be Nevermore or Hardened. And we have Nevermore. And Nevermore has, just like the Bloodthirst, which we talked about before, the Bleed, which is a focused blade ability that hits a random target and does a lot of damage to them with a bleed effect. Then it has a shield, which is the good old hit them in the back. It's basically a shield to put down, and you can only hit them in the back while they're channeling an ability. And then lastly, it has a stomp. And it's basically a stomp that you don't want to get hit by. If I remember correctly. It's just an AoE. Okay, it's an AoE hitting stomp, which is AoE damage.
Yeah.
And then the last mob was the Hardened that you can get from these mini bosses. And the Hardened has a Whirlwind, just like the Mangler, the first mob that we talked about. So you basically go out of that. It has Strike, which works a bit like Sweeping Strikes for Warrior, where it'll hit the nearest target, including the tank. So one person other than the tank will take like quite a bit of damage, but it's basically just healing those up. And then
it's not the nearest, it's just random. 2 targets.
It's just 2 targets, so it hits 2 targets. And then it has a Blow, which is a tank hitting ability, which hurts. And those are all the 6 different mini bosses. They are pretty similar. Each of them have like one ability different from the other most of the time. But yeah, it's not a lot. It's mostly just dodge mechanics. And they have a lot of HP and hits the tank quite hard.
Yeah, they do also afford quite a lot of percentage, which is why you get 2 prides in a very short space of time across this wing. Something quickly to mention about the Sweeping Strikes ability on the Hardened mob. The damage that it deals is also based off of the damage that the tank is taking when that thing procs. So as long as your tank is good, that damage is not going to be particularly particularly overwhelming and should be easy enough to heal up. It's why if you are able to consistently control which mini-boss spawns at the very end in particular, it's really important to get the hardened mob rather than the other one. The one with the shield, the Nevermore, it causes a lot of issues. It's a lot of AoE damage and a lot of unnecessary movement with the shield obviously blocking where your DPS can attack from. It is quite a bit of an issue, but in a 15, probably easy enough to deal with. If you do plan on pushing higher keys, try and get that timing down. I know that some people have spent a long time in that dungeon trying to sort out some kind of consistency to proccing which mob it is, but it's still nothing to make it super easy as of yet. It might as well be RNG at the moment, even if there is a method to be able to do it. But finishing off that wing there, that was very well explained, Faithy, going through all of that, so we'll give you a bit of a rest for now. And then we move on to Zav the Unfallen, who is just really annoying. just incredibly annoying. The duel mechanic is, while neat, it's incredibly frustrating. But we'll run through the abilities on this one. You've just seen the very first ability here, which is just a tank ability, the brutal combo. Just have some mitigation up for that one as a tank. That's all you need to be making sure of there. You have the banner that he's just dropped down here. The banner applies a stacking slow to everyone in the group. You want to be killing off that banner as quickly as possible in time for this, Might of Maldraxxus. He will leap into the middle, and he'll begin to cast one of 3 abilities in succession. So you have 3 types of abilities. He casts them all here. The very first one, which he will do, is the frontal ability, which is name I cannot remember. It's Crushing Slam. All of them are really easily telegraphed. I just want to point that out. This is probably the best example of well-telegraphed abilities that I've seen in quite some time. So you have Crushing Slam, a frontal, Massive Cleave, which is just a huge 180 cleave, and Deafening Crash, which is a zone around the boss where he will stomp and do damage and knock back anyone that's in that zone. Deafening Crash will also interrupt anyone that's casting at the time that it goes off. That is very important to note, because I'm sure a lot of casters have been caught out by that one. And if a healer gets caught out there, then that's not going to be good. Something to note about that combo is that it is random, unless it's the Deafening Crash first. If it's the Deafening Crash first, it is guaranteed to be 2 massive cleaves afterwards. So if you see the ring first, you know that there's going to be a massive cleave next, and then there's going to be another one straight afterwards. So don't worry about getting too far away from the first cleave. Stand on the edge just behind it, and then move yourself back over again when he turns around to do the next one. Because he basically does 180 in one direction, 180 in the other, just to mention that. And now we move on to the duel mechanic. You're not going to be able to see it very well here, but you just saw him cast Blood and Glory. He chooses 2 random DPS players to send down into the pit to fight each other. Whoever wins gets a damage debuff. Whoever loses gets a damage... whoever wins gets damage increase debuff, and whoever loses gets damage decrease debuff. That's a better way to put it. Under normal circumstances, what you would do with a coordinated group is you would have a look to see who has cooldowns, or who has cooldowns coming up soon, or who has the most consistent damage, and force someone to win as quickly as possible. If you send 2 people down there and they just start brawling it out, as much as you might really want to win, if you just send people down to brawl it out, it's just going to waste time, and it's not the best thing to do in theatre, because the timer itself is quite tight. If you don't have a huge amount of DPS, you want to make sure that that duel gets over and done with as quickly as possible, especially since you only have 1 DPS back up on the platform with the boss, and there is a banner that's spawning during that time. If that banner's not been destroyed by the time the next Might of Maldraxxus combinations come, someone is very likely to die. So you just want to make sure that you get those duels dealt with as quickly as possible. Other than that, there's not a whole lot else to mention on that boss. Just try and make sure that you are letting the right people win the duel, and that boss will fall over without too much of an issue. From there, we now move back over to the Abomination Wing, where we will go through the rest of the dungeon. Fem, do you want to run us through this next couple of pulls here?
Sure. In the pull we've already done, there was a horror, but we'll see that later, so we'll talk about that then. In this pull, you have a Butcher. The Butcher does a Devour Flesh cast. which is very important because it is stoppable with stuns and stuff, but not by interrupting it. And it basically heals for like 20% when it goes through. So you ideally want to stun it when it casts Devour Flesh. You also have the Sludge Spewers, which they do two different types of cast. One is just Decaying Filth, which is a hard-hitting magic damage ability on the tank. Also leaves a dot, which also takes quite hard magic damage. It's fine. But the most important one is Withering Discharge. If it goes through, it leaves a nasty debuff on the whole party for 30 seconds. So you definitely want to hold your kicks for Withering Discharge. However, you can do it as one melee kick, aka 15 seconds. It just went through on the screen here. That's why everyone's dropping low. Not good. But yeah, you can solo it as a melee. So if you have two melee who knows what they're doing and just takes one each, and then everyone else should be interrupting Decaying Filth, because that also hurts the tank.
Certainly also worth mentioning that as arranged on this pull and anywhere where you find those Sludge Spewers, you want to make sure that you're standing fairly close to melee. Those Sludge Spewers do jump around similar to the soldiers in Necrotic Wake, for example. If they're constantly jumping out of melee range and then they start casting their Withering Discharge miles away, it's gonna suck. Your melee's either going to have to get over there in double time, which if it's a DK, good luck with that. Hopefully they have grip available. But yeah, just make it easier. Try and move a little bit closer. Make sure that you make it easier for your melee. We already have a hard enough time as it is, so please help us out. Another incentive for kicking that Withering Discharge, by the way, the debuff reduces the damage that you deal. If that doesn't make you want to kick it, I don't know what else will. It's the same with the pools on the floor when they die, because it's exactly the same debuff. So yeah, it's definitely worth kicking that at all costs. Hopefully that should now incentivize every pug in the world to kick that ability. Smile. Okay, so you see this patrolling Gasbag in front. You never want to pull this. You want to avoid it at all costs. There are two ways you can avoid it, because it will patrol, or its patrol path is literally between the two doorways. You can see where it is right now, for example. It is right next to the doorway that Fem is looking to go through. But as it starts pathing back towards the entrance that they've just come from, they just wait for it to move and then go straight through. You can, if you have Invis or Shroud, you can just go straight past it, next to it, and that is absolutely fine. And then we move on to possibly the hardest pull in this dungeon, maybe? Maybe apart from the Gasbag. Maybe apart from the Gasbag. Yeah.
But yeah, in this pull you have the Butcher again, the Sludge Spewer, and then you just have the two small things that don't really do much. But you also have a Horror, which you also had in the first pull that we did earlier to get better prides. But it's basically the same as the one in Necrotic Wake. It does a Decaying Filth, I don't know, like ability on the tank. Leaves a dot, bad dot, hurts a lot. And then you also have the Meat Shield, which again, it's a cast into a channel. Try to kick in the cast, because then it doesn't apply the shield at all.
Yeah, absolutely. And now we have a Gasbag. This thing's a bitch. This thing's an absolute bit. It hits so hard. So, similar to Rot Spew in Necrotic Wake, the Gasbag has a damaging aura, which is just steadily dealing damage to everyone that's close by to the Gasbag. It also has an ability which you just saw there, and you'll see again in just a moment, which is a frontal and a backle, Vile Eruption. You want to stand on its side. If you get hit by either of those, you take a ton of damage and you get disoriented for a few seconds. It is very deadly, this mob, especially with Grievous. You can see, you just watch everyone's health slowly ticking. It's it doesn't hit the tank necessarily all that hard, I don't think. At Fem?
Which one?
The Gasbag?
No, not him himself, but like the aura still hurts.
Combination with the aura and what have you.
Yeah, exactly.
Sure. So yeah, it's mostly looking at group healing on that one, but it is a particularly dangerous mob that does need to be killed as soon as possible. And yeah, as you walk down, so something that's very important to do when you are pulling this gas bag is you do not want to walk too far down this ramp. What you'll see Fem do here as he's pulling the gas bag, he waits for it to path back towards the group here, because if you do go too far down, then it's a trap, and you suddenly get a lot of these little mobs on you, the same ones that you had at the very start of this room. There is one Sludge Spewer in here with the Withering Discharge cast that needs to be kicked, as well as all of these refuse mobs, which again, Fem mentioned them before. Little mobs, they really don't do anything. They drop these pools on the floor, which obviously you want to avoid. Otherwise, you take the debuff, which reduces the damage you deal, so you should want to avoid that at all costs. And then, yeah, you just polish this pack off as quickly as possible. Sludge Spewer, again, make sure you kick it. This pride, we all know and love our prides. And then the very final pull of this wing is a Butcher and a Horror together. So, again, as Fem mentioned, Devour Flesh casts from the Butcher and the Chops, as well as the Decaying Strikes from the Horror and the Meat Shield. Just make sure that they are dealt with appropriately, and it should be good. Yes, Fem?
Yeah, if you can, just skip these mobs like Imus pop them. I just didn't, because I didn't know if people had it, etc., etc.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, yeah, they're just overkill.
Yep, you can see that they've got the pride. This pride would definitely be better served going into Courtshop right now, the next boss. Yeah. But you know, if you're not able to skip them, don't worry about it. Just get these one dealt with quickly. You'll still have a little bit of pride left over for Courtshop, but obviously you want to have the full thing for the boss, because the boss certainly devastates the tank on this one. But Faithy, do you want to quickly run us through Courtshop here?
Yeah, so Courtshop, at least as a DPS player, is probably the easiest boss in the dungeon. It does hit very hard on tank due to its tank ability, which is Hateful Strike, which basically just hits very hard. Make sure you have your mitigation up for it or defensive up for it. It does slap really hard. Secondly, he spawns ads. Just like the previous ads, there are mobs that jump around. So if you're ranged, do feel free to stand as close to melee as possible. And just like previous mobs, when they die, they drop a pool on the ground that you just like to move out of. And those are the two, well, the last mechanic being, or not the last, but the next mechanic being the smash, which is a very small circle around the boss that you'll just have to go out of melee for. It will also drag you to the boss itself. So if you play ranged and you play far away from melee, it will drag you in. I'm pretty sure there's a yard threshold. How many yards is it? That if you stand close enough, you won't get dragged in.
I think it's just melee range.
Yeah, so if you're in melee range, or you're using your cooldowns, do feel free to stand in melee range as the boss won't drag you, or just in general, if you're sitting and hard casting, the closer you are to the boss, the less that he will cancel your casts. You do have to run out of the circle though, but you'll have to anywho, right? And then lastly, the mechanic that you'll get is meat hooks. First, you'll see a lot of meat hooks come down, and you'll see them going with two openings. And what you'll have to do is you have to go into the opening and then directly dodge after, as the opening will close as well with the remaining hooks coming in. So get into the opening and then just move left or right immediately to dodge all of the hooks. If you do get hit by the hooks, it will stun you and it will drag you into the side of the room where you'll take quite a lot of damage. But primarily it's the stun that's super scary, as the initial hit of the stun does a lot of damage. And that's the boss. It isn't the most difficult boss as a DPS player. It's pretty straightforward. But as a tank, you should look out for the Hateful Strike, as it does hit pretty hard, especially on higher keys.
Yeah, exactly. Hateful Strike, absolute tank slapper. It's not fun to deal with at all. I have tanked this key a total of twice and despised that boss, and that was only on a 18, I think. So I can't imagine how Fem feels doing it on 23s, 24s, and so on. It's not fun in the slightest. But I'm sure he'll love it on his Prot Warrior, to be fair.
Yeah, Warrior is kind of fine.
And then following on from Courtshop, there's no more trash to deal with. You now move on to the last boss, Mordretha, the Endless Empress. Not the most complex boss. Again, none of the dungeon bosses are particularly complex, I suppose. But it can be quite a long fight. on this one. But Mordretha split into 2 phases. The abilities in P1 do persist into P2 as well. There's just extra abilities in Phase 2 to deal with on top of all of the Phase 1 abilities, but we'll get into this one right now. First ability that we'll see on Fem right here is the Reaping Scythe, I believe. It is just a tank ability. It can be reflected by prop warriors, and it is reflected for damage. So this one is huge. The reason why I point out it being important that it's reflected for damage is there's not a whole lot of boss abilities in dungeons in Shadowlands that can be reflected for damage. Not like in BFA where it felt like almost everything could be reflected for damage and it made Prop Warrior completely broken. They're now broken for different reasons. It's not just for their damage anymore. You also have from Mordretha a Rift, which you just saw being cast just now. That Rift will try and drag people into the zone that you see on the floor underneath the Rift. If you do stand in that zone or get dragged into it, you're afflicted by a curse which deals damage over time and stuns you for a long amount of time. Obviously, being a curse, it can be dispelled by shamans or druids, or mages, of course. But the best practice is to just fight against the drag. It's easy enough to fight against. You do outrun it ever so slightly, but just make sure that you are running away from it. You do have plenty of time to pre-position as well. You see that as the hands are coming out right now, you see them here and here, just going out towards the members of the party. It's also just about forming its circle at the same time. So don't worry if you're at the side of the room and it spawns on top of you. You do have time just to move away from that one without too much trouble. You also saw on the very first drag, this doesn't always happen, but there are zones that appear under the players as well. These zones will count down. It's just a debuff that counts down over a certain amount of time. When that debuff ends, it spawns some adds. They have no HP. These adds do not scale with key level, as I found out the other day, and I still have no idea why. They really should scale with key level, but I'm also kind of happy that they don't. Try and stay relatively close to each other where possible. Don't overlap the circles on top of each other, obviously, but if you stay relatively close, they get AoE down in an absolute instant. Final ability of Phase 1 is the one that you just saw there, the Dark Devastation. Easy enough to deal with. She will face towards a random player, fire out a beam in front of her, and just rotate either counterclockwise or clockwise. It's different every time. You cannot predict that. If you get hit by it, you take quite a bit of damage and you get knocked back. You can just run away from it. It does rotate very slowly. Easiest way to dodge that, just by trying to stand as close into melee as possible. She then phases on 50% and goes into...
60.
Is it 60?
Oh no, it's 50.
No, it's 50.
Sorry.
Right, you know what? That's a cross for you. There we go.
Yeah,
there you go.
thank you.
But yeah, so 50% she goes into Phase 2, where it now begins Echoes of Battle. As mentioned, it's everything from P1. It's just with a couple of extra added things to look out for, which are, as I mentioned, the Echoes of Battle. So the first ones come immediately after the phase starts. You can see them all around the arena here and down here and over here. Pretty simple to dodge these. You can see they have a zone on the floor. You just move away from them. If you are stood in them, you will take quite a lot of damage when those zones go off, but you can literally just move away from them. Usually best to try and fight on the sides of the room, as it makes things a little bit easier to dodge. And these are the other echoes that you're seeing right now. You see the echoed riders on the sides of the room here. They will just look to charge through the middle of the room in the direction that they're facing. So you see this one's going to look to come down this way, this one is going to look to go this way, that one over there, and that one over there. And pretty simple, just find where they are, find where they're facing, move away from them, and make sure that you can dodge them all. Pretty simple. It can get a little bit hectic when you're dealing with overlaps of other abilities at the same time, but overall, the more you play the key, the more you play this boss, the more that you'll come to know what the overlaps are, because the overlaps are the same every time, so you can begin to prepare for them a little bit easier with every single pull that you do or every time you do this key. Would you say probably not the hardest boss in here, but certainly still tricky in its own right, yeah?
She's hard hitting.
Yeah.
But
the Reaping Scythe.
Hard.
The Reaping Scythe dealt damage in a very specific way. Am I right? Is it based on HP?
No, it's physical and magic.
It's both.
Just like hard card.
Got you. Okay, sure. So all in all, yeah, it's not a particularly it's one of those dungeons that it can trip a lot of people up. It's definitely quite a long dungeon, and it's not one with a very lenient timer either. That timer can be quite strict. In all honesty, I've definitely depleted a couple of higher theaters just due to not having enough damage. It's quite rough to time that one on higher keys in particular. But on a 15, you should be able to get that one done without much issue. It's mostly a pathing thing, but if you do that pathing that Fem's just shown you just now, you shouldn't have too much of an issue. Anything to add, gentlemen?
The timer says pretty linear. Like it is a long dungeon, and it will always be a long dungeon due to the design of the dungeon.
Yeah.
So even though the timer is looking like tight and you've wasted a lot, or it feels like you wasted a lot of time, that is just the design of the dungeon. You cannot speed it up a lot more.
Sure.
So yeah, that's basically.